Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. We're delighted to welcome Saugata Saha, the president of S&P Global Commodity Insights, and no better time than the eve of COP28, an event that we've all been waiting for here in the Middle East, here in the UAE, for some time. It was first announced in Glasgow, of all places, which seems like an eternity ago, COP26. And here we are on the doorstep of COP28. So welcome, Saugata. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
You're and in some ways, the very, very perfect person to have this week because you are the host, the convener of CERAWeek, which is held every year in March in Houston, the biggest thought leadership event in our energy industry in the world. And this year, of course, you hosted the COP president designate, the UAE Sultan Al Jaber, and he, in his speech at CERAWeek, had made what has been framed ever since a call to action for the energy industry to take up their role, our role in this big challenge of tackling climate change. Your thoughts 6-7 months later, whatever it is now, as we go into COP28, the call to action, what do you assess the current state of the global climate action?
Well, Sean, it's a topic that we could talk about for a very long time to come, but I'm going to summarize it in the next couple of minutes. Headline, I'd say, as you think about call to action for the call to action for climate action, so as to speak. The scenarios that we are modeling out at S&P Global Commodity Insight indicate that we are pretty far from, attaining the goal of the 2-degree warming scenario. Obviously, a lot of work we do at the company is based on scenarios. If you look at the 3 scenarios that we are working on, principally a base case, an optimistic case, and a pessimistic case, the base case really talks about, getting to about 2.4 degrees Celsius by about 2100. The year 2100. There is an optimistic scenario which talks about, a significant amount of carbon reduction, and that gets us to about a 1.7 degree global warming scenario by about 2100. And of course, there's a pessimistic scenario which talks about a 3-degree warming, and that obviously assumes that there is not a lot of abatement or reduction in the usage of, carbon-based fuels. So overall, I'd say, there's a lot more work to be done to get us to a path where we can get on track, so as to speak, to be on track to meet the Paris Agreement of several years ago.
Which, of course, in itself was a very, very ambitious 1.5 degrees with, at the time, a commitment by the developed economies to contribute $100 billion a year to help the developing world tackle the climate challenge. Of course, 8 or 9 years later, we're just getting the point where the developed countries are slowly meeting that, or at least the claim is that they're meeting at. That was the big item on the agenda last year in Egypt, that money wasn't forthcoming. What do you think are some of the key themes you expect to dominate the COP28 agenda in Dubai? Starting the COP28, of course, starts at the end of this week. You'll be attending. What do you think the key themes to be?
Sean, I think one of the themes is what you just alluded to. That's going to be one of the several themes we'll see and hear about, and which is around the financing, the climate action that we talked about. How do we make that happen? How do we go from vision to strategy to execution? Our forecasts indicate that over the next several years to come, globally, we need about 1.7 trillion, that's with a T, trillion dollars of financing each year. That's an annual number. And currently, if you look at what's being lined up and what's available, that gets us to only about 700 billion or so. So there's about a 50% gap in terms of the spread between, what's required and what's available. And that's not an insignificant number as you think about, the gap that needs to be overcome. But that's just one of the themes you'll hear about, in COP28. There's a few others I should mention. This will also be the first COP where, at least let's say, use the term stock taking is going to happen, where everyone's going to come around the table and look at what was planned and what was promised and what was intended and where we are. And you'll see
what was not achieved, perhaps.
And absolutely what was not achieved, and how do we bridge that gap? The second is, I think you'll hear a lot of conversations around phase out versus phase down and unabated versus abated use of fuels. And those have pretty significant implications. And, there are countries on very different starting positions on those negotiations. Financing of a lot of this climate transition or energy transition, whichever way you look at it, is also going to be on the list of things that will get talked about and negotiated. And then the last thing I should point out is that as you increasingly have seen, and COP28 will not be any different, you'll see a lot of conversations between the so-called global north and the so-called global south, where there's going to be a fair amount of discussion around how do we make sure that we can have a thoughtful climate transition or an energy transition while we can continue to bring, a billion people out of poverty across the world and increase the standard of living and prosperity of a few other billion people. So that's a lot on the agenda. That's a lot on the plate. But I think those are some of the things you'll see widely discussed at COP28, Sean.
So, when I mentioned in my introduction that the UAE was awarded the right to host COP28 while at Glasgow during COP26, and we came out of COP26 with a very significant wind in the sails of the energy transition and all of the pieces that make that possible, ultimately targeting a net zero, targeting with 1.5 degrees still, in very much in the optimistic and in the hope and in the intention of everybody coming out of Glasgow. And then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then we had energy security soar to the front of the queue and somewhat derailed the momentum behind energy transition as we went into Egypt and now into COP28. I'm wondering, from your perspective, from S&P's perspective, where you see those two things aligning. Has energy security trumped derailed energy transition? What are your thoughts on that combative narrative, either or, both together?
I'm more optimistic about, the long-term prospects of energy transition. Yes, the events of the last, call it three plus years have been a bit of a speed bump, because if you roll the clock back 3 years, Sean, your listeners and readers will remember that most of the conversation was about energy transition at any cost, right? And then we had the war in, Russia and Ukraine war, where everybody took a pause and said, hold on, energy transition is important, but we also need to figure out energy security and energy affordability, right? And now we have the scenario or the situation where I'd say everybody's really solving for the trilemma, which is energy security, energy affordability, and of course, energy sustainability. And very often these don't go hand in hand with each other, in the sense that you optimize for one, the other becomes a challenge, etc. And we anticipate that's going to continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. Today, if you look at energy consumption across the world, about 80% of it is hydrocarbon-based. And the scenarios we have, which look all the way out to 2050, talk about that number going to somewhere between 30 to 60%. So hydrocarbon-based energy will still be around for a long time to come. And the quest is on, and quest will continue to find out, how do we make sure that we can shift to an energy mix that is both sustainable and affordable at the same time. Keep in mind, there's a few billion people who are counting on affordable forms of energy for poverty eradication, to improve the standards of living. And energy is important as you think about manufacturing, as you think about mobility, as you think about just quality of life in terms of how people use it for heating, cooling, etc. So a long answer to your question, Sean, but energy transition, in my mind, is very much alive and around. However, it is now being solved in a much more pragmatic manner in coordination with affordability considerations and long-term sustainability considerations.
It is
and
a
security,
sort
of
of,
course.
I mean, you mentioned in your earlier comments there, one of the talking points that you would expect to be hearing when you come to Dubai for COP28 later this week is the question, or the theme of phase out of fossil fuels or phase down of fossil fuels. And indeed, the president designate of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber himself, has been putting forward those those sort of realities, as he puts it, in terms of the industry having to sort of come to terms or somehow grip those, not only the industry, but also countries that are heavily dependent on this industry, including our own in this region. How likely do you think countries will agree to that phase out versus phase down? How big of an argument do you think that will be in this COP or in any COP?
Um, I, I think that will be one of the contentious areas of discussion, especially if you look at some of the large economic blocs, be it the European Union or India. And there's two things that's going to be discussed and negotiated. One is whether it's a phase out or whether it's a phase down, a much more pragmatic approach, and also the timelines around when it's got to happen. And then going along with phase down or phase out is the key consideration, Sean, of whether it's an abated use of fuels or abated use of fuels, right? Obviously, having abated use of fuels helps our hydrocarbons stay in the energy mix much longer, while being able to, quote unquote, offset a lot of the emissions related to the hydrocarbons, which of course gets us to a much more pragmatic approach. I'm not going to try and predict what the outcomes will be. These are very fluid, and we'll find out, very quickly in the next few days. The one thing I should mention in the context of both the phase out, phase down, and unabated use of fossil fuels is the whole construct and concept of carbon markets. We were talking earlier about what are some of the big themes that we expect to see get discussed and come out of COP28. My sense is carbon markets will be one of those, and how carbon markets set up a global mechanism of valuing and trading carbon will be an important part of how we get to net zero. Remember that
it seems to be one of the big missing pieces now. I mean, got carbon price. There's a variety of carbon markets emerging. Carbon price still not there. I mean, obviously, you guys are the curators of the world's biggest benchmarks. Do you see something like that emerging? You have Brent for oil, of course, that you guys curate. Anything comparable, even on the horizon, for carbon?
Sean, I'd start by saying that, it's important to remind everybody that the term we all use is net zero, not zero. And a big part of what helps us to get to the net zero is carbon. So far, we don't see anything out there that is kind of, the new Brent of carbon, so as to speak. Having said that, we at Commodity Insights at S&P Global are hard at work helping build meta registries, helping build carbon intensity assessments, and also carbon assessments in terms of prices. And those will be an important part of the energy consideration in the future. One of the things we've been focused on, and we think this is going to take shape in a meaningful way, is to assess the carbon intensity of various grades of oil. One of the things we've put out there, and your readers can look it up online. It's free and available to everyone. Is what we call the Platts periodic table of oil, which also includes information around carbon intensity. And it's just the first important step in identifying and acknowledging that various grades of oil have different carbon intensities, and over time that will become an important part of the trading consideration, so as to speak.
There's a lot of talk inevitably about the abatement and reducing carbon, and ultimately, obviously, that against us all, and then this region, of course, into the conversation of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, etc. But of course, the other big part of this conversation is the solution of renewables, solar, wind, hydrogen. How do you anticipate the discussions around new renewable energy unfolding at COP28?
We think there's going to be 3 or 4 big things on renewable energy coming up at COP28. One of those big ones would be hydrogen. Hydrogen has been much talked about, but it is an important ingredient, we believe, for hard to abate sectors. And without that, it's going to be incredibly hard to decarbonize many sectors such as steel and cement and aluminum, etc. So we'll be keep an eye open for what the discussion is around hydrogen and what permitting, licensing countries are willing to talk about, what incentives and Philips countries are willing to provide to grow hydrogen as an important part of the energy mix. The second, going back to the theme of carbon, Sean, will be around CCS or CCUS, carbon capture and sequestration. And that, again, is an important part of the mix of technologies and themes that will be available to help us get to net zero. There have been a lot of interesting developments in the last year or two in terms of direct air capture, new technologies for sequestration, etc., which we should expect to hear a lot more about. And then the last thing I would say, which is, quote unquote easy one, and I say quote unquote easy because nothing like this at scale is easy, is elimination of methane from the production systems and the supply chains, etc., which alone can go a long way in helping us get towards
well, these are big sort of low-hanging fruit, aren't they? I mean, the methane in the oil and gas industry is a very big low-hanging fruit that one would hope the call to action that His Excellency Sultan Al Jaber has advocated this year. He has punctuated methane quite often.
Yeah, look, methane is one of those so-called proverbial low-hanging fruits, but it's not going to be easy in the context of you need a fair amount of resources and money to be able to do it. It involves going in. There are some big things which you can start with, such as no flaring, etc. But then, you're looking at lots of pipelines, lots of valves, lots of interconnects where you've got to go and retrofit equipment to make sure that you get to a path of zero or as low methane emission as possible. So methane, I think, would be the third one, which could help us at scale in the near term get to the path that we want to.
Well, that's a good point to just sort of conclude on, Saugata, and that is the investment, that is needed in order to maintain that supply of energy, that affordable energy. As you mentioned, billions of people in the world still hope to get access to. All of this uncertainty around where the role of hydrocarbons will be in the future sort of disincentivizes investment in new capacity. How do you think those two things balance out, and what signals are needed coming out of COP28 in order to ensure that energy security in the future?
Yeah, Sean, we are starting to see a uptick in CapEx going into the, overall oil and gas and energy, E&P sectors in particular. Since 2020, which was kind of an all-time low, we've had sequentially increasing years of CapEx going in, which is a good sign as you think about future demand and supply. As I mentioned earlier, hydrocarbon isn't going to 0% of the energy mix anytime soon. So that's kind of a good sign. Having said that, the levels that we are currently at are well below the 2014 levels, which were the highest recorded. And I should also point out that,
the highest levels of investment on an annual basis. Yeah,
exactly, annual basis that we've ever seen. But I should also point out that investments in energy transition is starting to pick up. Last year alone, or I should say this year, it's still 2023. This year alone, we expect about $500 billion of investments in energy transition related projects. That is a sizable number, and we expect that's going to continue to grow. So overall, I think there's going to continue to be oil price volatility. I won't spend too much time talking about oil price, given how much material we put out there and how much conversation there is about that anyway.
Well, it is another big week with OPEC meeting on the day before COP starts.
Absolutely. And, on that, Sean, a lot depends on what Russia and Saudi decide to, the two key members of OPEC Plus decide to do with their voluntary cuts. Nonetheless, we think that oil prices will stay somewhere in the 75 to 95 range. We are predicting for the next, call it to the end of 2024, a high 80s oil price. Of course, there's a lot of events that could change that, as always. But an important part of that would be it creates value to support ongoing investments in finding future oil and gas sources.
Well, it's certainly a dollar number that seems to be where the world is comfortable on a producer and consumer level. Somewhere in the 80s, it seems to be the Goldilocks spot. We'll have to wait and see what the big OPEC decision is. But more importantly, in these coming week, COP28, lots to digest, lots to think about, and have a safe trip and have a great COP28. I hope it delivers all of the insights that you are expecting, we are expecting. We are all vested. Thank you so much, Saugata Saha, President of S&P Global Commodity Insights, for being this week's guest on Halftime Talk.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks for having me.